Welcome everybody to tonight's presentation. My name is Tim Tomasic. I'm a sergeant with the Marshall Police Department, and tonight we're going to be having an informational meeting regarding a level 3 predatory offender that's moving to Marshall. On the table back near where you came in the door, you find some public fact sheets. Feel free to grab one. Hopefully we'll have enough for everyone. And you may have also seen or been handed a pencil and an index card. Those are going to be for any questions that you might have later on. Toward the end of the presentation, we'll have a Q&A section, and we would invite any reasonable question, and hopefully we'll have an answer for you. Tonight's presentation is going to be facilitated by Mark Bliven with the Minnesota Department of Corrections, and Mark has a PowerPoint presentation here that's going to contain a lot of information for you, and at the conclusion of that, he'll invite questions, and we have a number of professionals from different disciplines here, prosecution, corrections, law enforcement, who hopefully will be able to answer any questions that you might have. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I'm with the Department of Corrections. We also have some agents here. We have 4 of the agents who are on the supervising team. We also have their supervisor here. Plenty of law enforcement folks. We have some folks who are working with victim services also, and the whole group of people here that we hope will give you an opportunity to get all your questions answered. This meeting tonight, it's part of our community notification process. The legislature back in 1996 said that in certain cases they wanted to give broad public notification, be more proactive about getting information about certain offenders into the community. So this is part of that process, making sure that you have the opportunity tonight to find out the story about a particular person we're talking about and get your questions answered. Now later we'll have a question and answer period, but I also want to emphasize that if you don't feel like asking the question out in the open, I mean some people do have questions that they'd rather be a little more private, do feel free to come up afterwards and ask those questions of me or anybody else here, the agents, other people attending the meeting. So you have the opportunity to ask the questions for everyone or come up afterwards. We will stay around until everybody has their questions answered. So, start out here, just giving you the agenda here. Going to talk a little bit about registration, registrants in the community, the community notification process, how we do a risk level assignment, which is what triggers our ability to have a meeting like this, specifics about the individual we're talking about tonight who is moving into Marshall, and then resources that we have, and then give you the opportunity to ask questions. So, registrants, there are lots of registrants who live in our communities in Minnesota. It's not unique, and the person we're talking about tonight is not the only person who is a registrant. They've always lived in our community, they've always interacted, they've been in the community, but as I said, back in 1996, the legislature decided that certain of those offenders were going to be more proactive about sharing information. So, first thing was, before community notification, we actually had registration. And registration means that people convicted of certain offenses have to maintain their information after their conviction, maintain that with law enforcement. They have to provide information on where they live, any properties they own, where they're employed, any motor vehicles that they own or operate, so that the whole purpose of that is that local law enforcement can always get a hold of them, whether they're at home, whether they're at a secondary residence, whether they're at work, whether they're at school, whether they're operating their car. So that information is always available to law enforcement for people subject to registration. So, who is subject to registration? Well, for the most part, you hear the term sex offender. The definition we use in Minnesota for those subject to registration, we actually use the term predatory offender because it's not strictly limited to only sex offenders. And when we say that they're subject to registration, it means that in their history, they have been charged with either a sex offense or additionally two other things, kidnapping or false imprisonment. If they've been charged with that crime and then convicted of that crime or anything arising out of that same set of circumstances, then they're subject to this registration requirement. Again, what that means is that even though they may be back in the community, and most people who are convicted of crimes end up living in our communities, if they have one of these registration offenses, they have to maintain that information with law enforcement. Earlier in the process, that registration for most lasted 10 years, as long as they remained law-abiding during that 10 years. What has changed is that we've lengthened that registration period, and if they're actually convicted of criminal sexual conduct, now their registration lasts for life. But if it's not directly a conviction for criminal sexual conduct, then the registration is 10 years and gets extended if they get into trouble or go to jail for any other reason. But it's either 10 years plus enhancements or lifetime. So, in Minnesota, there are more than 17,000 people who are subject to this registration requirement. That means that 17,600 people in Minnesota are maintaining their information with law enforcement. And if you look just in Lyon County, there are 62 people throughout the county. 43 of those live within the city of Marshall. So we're talking about one person tonight who has been designated as a level 3, but there are also another 42 or 43. Those numbers will change. People move in, move out, but there are lots of people who are subject to registration. They're not subject to this broad public notification though. But rest assured that local law enforcement and your county's sheriff's department know about all the registrants in your community. So they're able to track them, keep an eye on them, make sure they're maintaining their information with law enforcement. Just to compare that, if you look at Redwood County, they have 53 registrants. Murray County, which is a pretty small county, population-wise, only has 15 registrants in the whole county. Then you look at a place like Hennepin County, our most populous county in Minnesota, they have 2,500 registrants in the county. And if you look at just the city of Minneapolis, we're talking about one level 3 here in Marshall. In the city of Minneapolis, there are about 150 level 3s, or 150 people subject to broad public notification. So it really the number of registrants in a community really is reflective of what your overall population is. So I think our lowest population county is Kitson County up in Northwest, and they have the fewest number of registrants. So we have that registration law that started in 1991. In 1997, we started the Community Notification Act. And basically what that does now is that anybody who goes to prison, before they are released from prison and they're a registrant, and not all registrants go to prison. If you're convicted, subject to registration, more often than not, you'll get local jail time or local probation. So everybody convicted of one of these offenses does not go to prison. Keep that in mind. But those who do go to prison, before they leave prison, we have a committee that looks at each individual case. We review the entire background, the entire file of that person, look at risk factors associated with them, and we assign a risk level designation. If they've got a higher number of risk factors associated with them, they're likely to get a level 3 designation, which is the highest level of notification, meaning we can do a broad public notification. If they're in the moderate range, it's a level 2, and then everybody has at least a level 1. In all cases, whether it's 1, 2, or 3, that review results in a report and a compilation of information, background information, and before that person leaves prison, we take that information and we send it to local law enforcement so that they know more details about those registrants who are coming back into their community. So they don't necessarily share it on everyone with the broad public in those cases, but they do have that available. On those who don't go to prison, there's less information. We haven't done a thorough file review and put together essentially a synopsis of their background for law enforcement. So, community notification, it applies to anybody who goes to prison and then is subject to registration when they're released. And it doesn't matter if it's prison in Minnesota or another state and they're planning to live in Minnesota or the federal system. Any registrant who is going to live in Minnesota and has been to prison, any prison, will be subject to this risk level assignment and possibly to level 3 designation. Who it doesn't apply to, it doesn't apply to juveniles. Juveniles are actually subject to registration, but since they don't go to prison unless they're certified as an adult, they don't get a risk level designation. And then the larger number are those who go to prison or do not go to prison. Again, as I said, local jail or local probation. And of those 17,600 registrants, about 9,000 of them have a risk level. And then almost 9,000 don't have a risk level because they've never been to prison. So, this community notification process, we as the Department of Corrections, our responsibility is to assign that risk level. Do that research, review the cases, set the designation, and then we take that information and hand it off to local law enforcement. So even though I'm talking about this process tonight, this meeting really is a meeting from the marshal police department, because local law enforcement then has the ability to put together the plan for notification. And most often, it's going to include an opportunity for a public meeting, but it also includes us posting information on an internet website about the person, so that any level 3 living in the community is available on a website that's administered by the Department of Corrections. But that information has been authorized by your local law enforcement agency. But everyone has to do that. So if a level 3 is living in the community anywhere in Minnesota, they're going to be on that website. And then also just how much publicity, how much information. So the information we talk about tonight, some of it may be private information, but because law enforcement is authorizing this meeting, they also have the ability to release it. So if we talk about something tonight, you can talk about it with your friends, neighbors, relatives. You can share that information because it's being made public tonight. And I'll point out one real specific area that's generally private and that we can't talk about, but because of the level 3 designation, we're allowed to talk about it. So, if somebody's assigned as a risk level 1, what that means is that packet of information goes to local law enforcement. They can share it with other law enforcement agencies. They can also share it with designated people who have been designated to get broader public notification. And that designation is made by your local county. If they were prosecuted in Lyon County, then the Lyon County Attorney's Office, after the trial, after the hearing, can designate victims, witnesses, others who get a little bit broader notification. But that applies to level 1s. There's no general public notification for level 1s. Level 2s, that's a little bit more open to notification. In this case, it's the same type of notification, sharing it with other law enforcement to designated victims, witnesses, but it also, law enforcement can notify those organizations that might serve people who could be victims of that particular offender. So depending on the offender's offense history, law enforcement may go to certain places and tell the administration or the management of the facility that keep your eye out for this person. If they're hanging out or hanging out around your business, we want you to be aware that may be questionable behavior for them. So make sure you keep an eye on them. Make sure that if you have any questions about that you contact law enforcement about that. They may not be committing a crime, but we do want to be aware, and that gives that ability. And the example I would use is if somebody has a history of hanging around with teenagers, an adult who was hanging around teenagers and developing relationships with them and then having inappropriate or illegal contact with them, we'd want to notify those places. And that could be any place from a youth center to a recreation center. It could be the local McDonald's. If that's a place that teenagers hang out in a generally unsupervised area, it might be a good idea to let the management at the McDonald's know that keep your eye out for this particular person. That is a level 2 that has been, has that history. And then we've got level 3, and that just, as I said, broad public notification. Basically anything is allowed for law enforcement to release the information that they believe is going to help enhance public safety. So, now it's not 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 on our designations. Actually, level 3s make up about 15% of all those that we review. So only about 15%. 29% are level 2s, and the majority are level 1s. Again, everybody who's subject to registration, who leaves prison, gets, at a minimum, a risk level 1. So, as of January 29th, there are 380 registrants. We're talking about one of those tonight, but there are 379 others in the community in Minnesota. And as I mentioned, 150 of those are just in the city of Minneapolis, but they're pretty much spread out around the state. Again, probably just a handful in this whole region, but there are level 3s that are in almost every part of the state. Now something I want to talk about is a piece of information that I don't think a lot of people realize, and that is recidivism rates for sex offenders have gone down dramatically over the years. Back in 1990, before we had registration, community notification, before we had enhanced supervision, before we had more widely developed treatment programs, we had a recidivism rate, and when I say recidivism rate, those who commit a new sex offense, that recidivism rate was about almost 17%, 16.7% in this study that we did. That was everybody released from prison. We followed them for 3 years, and 16.7 of them reoffended with a new sex. And it's important to keep that in mind, is the most important way of reducing recidivism for sex offenders is to catch them, hold them accountable. Those that commit most sex offenses aren't the ones we've already caught. They're the ones who have not been caught yet. The best thing we can do to stop a sex offense behavior, and we've had sex offenders who have been committing sex offenses for years, and they're not on our radar. We don't know about them, but once we catch them, that's our way of stopping and putting an end to that sex offending behavior. Not completely. We still have sex offenders who have been caught, held accountable, and reoffend, but it's a very small minority of offenders. Those who have been subject to scrutiny, especially by those who know them, don't get the opportunity. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And this was an additional study that was done. It showed a recidivism rate of 3.3%, a later one that was completed back in 2012. We haven't seen those numbers going up. We're pretty confident that those numbers are staying below. Are we ever going to be satisfied, you know, at 3% recidivism? No. We do continue to maintain the way we monitor and supervise these offenders, but what we've seen is great success in what we've been doing. And we have to say that community notification, when we've seen it and studied that also, we've seen that it has had an effect, that it is good to have the community involved as partners in the monitoring of certain offenders. So this was an interesting, again, sort of shows who is it who is committing most of the sex offenses in Minnesota. We have 14 years of convictions for criminal sexual conduct. From 2000 to 2014, actually 15 years there. 7% of those committing a new criminal sexual conduct offense were on our registry. 93% of those who committed sex offenses were not on the registry, meaning we didn't know about them. Law enforcement didn't know about them. Corrections didn't know about them because they had not been caught or held accountable for their sexual offending behavior. So that's what we want to make sure that people keep in mind, is that those we've caught and held accountable, we still want them to be held accountable, but more important than that, we want people to be aware of what's going on around them. Because sex offenders are not just people who drive into town and snatch somebody and sexually offend against them. Most sex offenses are committed by people who are in some kind of a relationship. Their acquaintances, unfortunately, about a quarter of them tend to be relatives, family members. We're pretty confident that less than 10% of all sex offenses are committed by people who aren't in some kind of a relationship, either social, family type of relationship. That the true stranger type offense is fairly rare. It's disturbing, but it makes up, a small minority of those offenses. Here's a chart that shows these are just the ones who were getting out of prison in 2012. We saw that 26% were family members. The victim offender relationship, more than a quarter were family members. Another 60% were acquaintances. That is, they were known, they were in a relationship. And then 14%, we didn't have a clear definition. Some of those may have been true stranger type offenses, but others it was unclear of what that direct relationship was. So, might be a little disconcerting, but we want you to keep in mind that most of those who are going to be committing sex offenses in your community, you already know, or the victim knows. Another thing to keep in mind is who the victims are. About a third of the victims are under the age of 13. Another third are those teenage years, 13 to 17, and then another third are adults. Important thing to keep in mind on that also is that what this chart shows you is that the most vulnerable time to be victimized is not 0 to 12 or as an adult, but it's actually the teenage years from 13 to 17. Because that's the smallest age range in here, but it makes up fully a third of all the victims. Those who are age 13 to 17 make up about 9% of our population, but they make up 3 times that, 33% of the victims. Why is that? Why do we think that? It's because starting at the age of 13, that's when our kids are becoming more independent. They're going out, developing their own relationships. They may not be that aware of who they're getting involved with. They're looked upon as vulnerable by those who want to take advantage of them. So it is. That's why we always emphasize, make sure you know who your kids are in a relationship with, who their friends are, who they're developing. When they're 12 and under, for the most part, we know who they're developing relationships with. We still have to be concerned with those people because, again, most of the offenders against those 12 and under are going to be known people. Once again, the family members, but also acquaintances, maybe family members of their friends, maybe people you've entrusted the care of your children. That's where we have offending, whether it's teachers, professionals, those who should be trusted and that we should have confidence in taking care of our children in a healthy way. But unfortunately, we find too often that those are the people who are committing those offenses. So, we're going to talk about the specific person, level 3, who's moving to Marshall. His name is James Nicholas Dollinger. These are recent photos of him. He's 36 years old, 5'4", 199 pounds, so he's a little bit shorter, stockier size. Green eyes, brown hair. He's going to be living in the 600 block of West Main Street. If you're familiar with that, it's pretty close to the police station. His history. His history goes back, actually, his sexual offending history is fairly old, but, and it includes both juvenile and adult convictions. He's also had a history of chemical abuse, which is not unusual for those who go to prison. But when I said private information is open to disclosure to you, normally when somebody has a juvenile history of offenses, that information is closed. But because he was designated as level 3, we can now open up, just so you have a better understanding of what his history is. We don't want people to think of sex offenders as all the same. A sex offender is not a sex offender, is not a sex offender. Each one has a specific history, and there are specific issues or risks that are uniquely connected to them. And that's one of the reasons we want to talk about them. We don't want people in Marshall to say, it's a sex offender, and not know what specific things are important in his particular case. So, back in 1994, 4, he was 13 years old. Again, if he was not a level 3, you would not be hearing about this, but we are going to talk about this. At 13, age 13, he was involved in sexual offending against a 3-year-old. He was adjudicated as a juvenile. He went through treatment programs dealing with that. Then in 2000, as an adult now, he had sexual contact with a 12-year-old female, gained access because he was known to the family, was involved with the family, took advantage of that, and sexually offended. He was given, again, if he'd been caught and then didn't do anything wrong after that, he wouldn't have gone to prison, we wouldn't know about that. He was given a chance here. He was put on probation. He did not cooperate with the probation. It's not that he committed a new sex offense, but he failed in his ability to cooperate with the conditions of his probation. So the sentence that he received, the prison sentence he received, was then put in place, and he went to prison for it. That's what we mean by sentence executed, as mean it was hanging over him. If he cooperated, he would not go to prison. He didn't do very well in that, went to prison. And because he went to prison, then he gets assigned a risk level. And because of his history, behavior, chemical dependency issues, he was assigned as a risk level 3. So, he then, in 2007, you'll see the next thing. He didn't commit new sex offenses to go back to prison, but what he did is he got involved in a string of robberies. And he was looking for an easy way to get money and did a string of robberies. Not around his home, but he got into a car and traveled long distances, kind of spread it out all over the southern half of Minnesota. He was caught, and he came to prison for that. Not for a new sex offense, but for that string of robberies. And he did get out recently. He was in some transitional housing in another area, but now he's out in the Marshall area. He'll be under correctional supervision until the year 2020, so it'll be a little more than 2 years more than he's on supervision. And I'll go through some of the details of supervision. Additionally, he'll be required to register for life. And he's required to register for life because he has one registration offense, you commit another registration offense. So as a juvenile, he committed a registration offense, and then as an adult at age 18, he committed a registration offense. So he got lifetime registration for that. So during this time, when he's being supervised in the community, this is one of those things we learned over the years. When we have somebody designated with higher risk factors associated with them, we put them on a higher level of supervision called intensive supervised release. And that's by statute. That started at the beginning of that period, as I showed you earlier, when our reoffense rates were higher. Since that time, we've seen those offense rates go lower. And in fact, when we look at level 3s who are under intensive supervised release, we essentially have had a 0% recidivism rate. But all those aspects of the supervision are important. Do some of them go back to prison? Yes, they do, but not usually for a new sex offense or even a new criminal offense. It's often because they're not quite cooperating well enough with supervision. So, primary objective is public safety. So that's number one at all times under this supervision process. If public safety is at risk, they're able to step in there and do something about it. It's a highly structured system of supervision. We've got the four agent team here. This is a process that is it's 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, 7 days a week. There are no holidays. He's always subject to this supervision. If necessary, we can have agents show up and check on him at 3 in the morning or New Year's Eve, whatever. As necessary, this team, so there are 4 here, so one of them is always available to be monitoring or dealing with this person if necessary. Because it's a higher level of supervision, we've got reduced caseloads. So unlike regular supervision or probation, we don't have caseloads of 50, 75, 100 offenders. It's a very limited number so that it's very manageable for these agents to manage them. And the intensive supervised supervision system is highly structured. There are certain requirements that are necessary, stages that they go along, and the whole intent of this is to have more highly structured in the beginning, and as the person demonstrates that they're being cooperative, they may be able to then loosen that structure so that the real goal always of supervision is that by the time the person is done with their time being supervised, that it'll be a sort of a seamless transition from supervision to no supervision anymore. So there is a plan for 2 years to hopefully get him moved so that he is going to be self-regulating himself, because that's the key part, is we don't want to have a system where we have to be watching somebody 24 hours a day. What we want to do is develop the tools in that particular person that they're doing their own self-regulation. But it's kind of that thing, we trust, but we're doing lots of verification. So I always say, I don't know if trust is really what's going on here. What we're doing is making sure, verifying at all times. Make sure they're in compliance with any of the release conditions, and there are restrictions. They're not just able to go about their life in the community. There are restrictions. But we do want successful reintegration into the community. We want him to be well self-regulated by the time he's done in 2 years. And again, as I pointed out, it's a 24-hour-a-day program. So it's 2 years of constant programming supervision. What are some of the aspects of intensive supervised release? There is house arrest, meaning when necessary, they can say, you must stay in your house. You have very limited ability to leave the house. But again, as they demonstrate better cooperation, they're going to get more flexibility in that. Electronic monitoring, they can use that electronic monitoring. It's not something that illicit drugs or even alcohol. They can't. He's not going to be able to partake of alcohol. These unannounced visits, as I said, they can stop in at 3 in the morning to do verification checks. They can stop in at their workplace, make a check. Just random, unannounced visits are well within the program. And then a daily check-in. So even if, this is a big territory, there will not be an agent here 24 hours a day. Not even many days, they may not one-on-one connect with this person, but there is a daily check-in requirement. And again, always that possibility that the agent, one of the 4 agents, will stop in. And then any kind of necessary treatment, follow-up treatment, those requirements are also necessary. Now, on intensive supervised release, some of these things are some of the exclusions, but not necessarily all of them. What's most important are what are those triggers? With his offending behavior actually being very old, some of the sex offender restrictions aren't in place for him, but at the same time, he's going to have a very strict schedule. So even though he's not forbidden to have contact with minors, he's also not allowed to hang around places where minors congregate. There's no reason for him to do that, so he's not going to be given that permission. That's part of that structuring. If there are concerns, and you as community members, if you have concerns about certain places that you think he might be hanging around, absolutely contact his agents and you can have a discussion about that, and that may be very valuable information for them. You know your community better than us. So even though the agents here are very familiar with your community, they don't know everything. That's why we think it is useful that you're aware of what's going on here. Things like use of the internet. It's important for people to use the internet now. Can he use the internet to get a Facebook account and start interacting with young people? No, he can't do that. He'll be monitored. He will not get free access to internet yet, but he may eventually get a little more access to that. So, the team, and we actually have all 4 members of the team here. Tony, right here. Brett, Morgan, and McKay. So these 4 agents, why don't you stand up and let them see your faces here. So These 4 agents are going to be coming through, they're gonna stop, they're gonna visit with Mr. Dollinger. They're responsible for what he's doing. So on those fact sheets that you picked up, there's a contact number for the agent. So if you have questions for them, non-emergency type questions for them, feel free to give them a call. They won't necessarily pick up the phone and, if you need law enforcement at 3 a.m. in the morning, don't call the agents. But you can call the agents and leave a number, a message, and they'll get back to you. But no, they're not going to necessarily be answering the phone 24 hours a day, but they do have access to that, and when something happens, they will get those messages. But again, if it's a general question, don't call at 2 in the morning and say, call me right back. If it is something where you need assistance, call 911. Law enforcement will be able to respond more quickly to any issue. And that's involving this guy or anybody else in the community. I think one of the most important things that people forget is that 911 is important. If you need the assistance of a police officer, a sheriff's deputy, that's the number you call. Don't try to figure out whether it's enough of an emergency, because the person who answers the call when you call 911, they'll be able to sort it out. They'll know who should be contacted. So you don't worry about it. More often than not, we have people who don't call when they should be. So don't hesitate. But don't call 911 if you want to know what the temperature is going to be tomorrow morning. I mean, be a little realistic on that. But if you think you need the assistance of a law enforcement officer, do call 911. So, community involvement, that's important. You are the people who are the best source for information. The safest community is the most involved community. And this is one of my favorites. We're all crime fighters. Superman, Spider-Man. When was the last time you saw Superman or Spider-Man in your community? They don't get around that much. But that lady, I bet you all know her, or some of you are her. And it doesn't matter if you're a 14-year-old kid, a 30-year-old person, if you're paying attention to your community and you get on the phone and you report something questionable, you're the greatest crime fighter your community has. The worst thing for local law enforcement is if people don't talk. If people aren't paying attention to what's going on around them. And you are going to have a crime-free community if you're like that lady. You see something, you say something about it. That's so important. If law enforcement doesn't hear from you, they're going to have a very tough time keeping your community crime-free. But if you communicate with them, you're going to have an effective law enforcement presence. So, you have Mr. Dollinger. You have the right to know about him. It's important that you know his history. But also it's important to know that community transition, he does have a right. He's done with his prison sentence. He is allowed to move back into the community. He's allowed to go about his business, work, get training, shop, go to medical appointments, those things that are necessary for him to transition back into the community. 95%, more than 95% of all people who go to prison get out and move back into the community. We need to have successful transition. So be aware of his behavior. You have the right to keep an eye on him. Be vigilant about things. Don't be a vigilante though. Don't try to make his life miserable. Don't try to mess around with him. But you have the right as community members to be aware of him. So, again, general questions, call the Marshall Police, but again, if you need assistance, call 911. And I'm not saying that just about this guy. It's about anything in your community. So, it's important that we have this awareness that more than 90% of those who are registered offenders do not reoffend. 90% are known to the victim. It is the people we know who are going to offend against us and against those we know. And 90% of those who commit sex offenses have no sex offense conviction history or registration history. So it would be nice if you could say, oh, we've identified every sex offender. We don't have to worry about anybody else. When the reality is most of those who are going to offend in our community are not yet known. And it's about relationship, not proximity. It really doesn't have anything to do with you living 3 blocks down from a guy or even across the street. What it has to do with is what kind of relationship do you have with people? And anybody who's engaged in questionable behavior, those should be the people you're concerned about. Whether it's him, if you do see him engaged in behavior that's questionable, that you're concerned about, that looks like he could be up to no good, absolutely report that. But do that also with everybody else in your life, because that's what's going to keep us safe. Is not just that you report about those in your community, but that you report about everybody in all our communities. So resources we have, there are handouts back on that table if you got those. These are great websites to go to. I like to promote the Jacob Wetterling Resource Center. I think they really have a great focus on family safety ideas, and we have a couple of handouts on the back table there about that, family nights. But also, you have a local victim services provider. Sometimes there may be issues that you don't want to go to the police about or the sheriff's department about, but you still have questions, you want assistance, or you've been victimized and you don't want to go to law enforcement, or you have concerns about the possibility of victimization. What's great is that you have a local resource, New Horizons Crisis Center, right here. Do you want to stand up, introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Trista Lane, and this is Holly and Megan.
So if you call up, they have a 24-hour crisis line, their daytime office number right there. you want to contact somebody, they're a great resource, a local resource to help you out with questions. You may not even know specifically what kind of help you want. They're a great resource to steer you in the right direction. And they can connect with others in the community that might be able to provide you with specific assistance. And I think you have some handouts on the back, so make sure you pick up their contact information. It's great to have some of these national organizations or statewide organizations that are available on the internet, and I think they do a great job, but there's nothing that can compete with having local people here who know the resources and how to assist you in this. So, this is also on our resource sheet. It's just the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension and the Minnesota Department of Corrections. If you want to look into some of the studies, details on that, go to our website, Minnesota. You can just Google Minnesota DOC and it'll get you right to our website. And we have a lot of studies, additional information, some additional resources. You can also see our level 3 or our public registrant website. All those listings, it'll show all 380 people who are in the community subject to broad public notification. You can search by name, but you can also search by zip code, by county, by city. So if you want to find out information about any others in the community, you can look on that website. What I always say is that, sure, that's an interesting website that we administer, but I don't know how much valuable it is. I think the real value to you is just be aware of who's in your community, what's going on, be aware of what's going on, rather than trying to memorize 380 photographs and say, oh, I should be afraid of those people. I have to say, because of the way we monitor and supervise them, they're kind of the least of our concerns. Even though he's a level 3, there are risk factors associated with him. Because he's been identified, we're now managing, supervising, monitoring that so that those risk factors will not result in reoffending. We wish we could do that with other potential sex offenders, but we don't know who they are. So that 90% who have not yet been identified, those are our biggest concerns, and who's best to identify them? It's you. Stay aware. Stay aware of what they are, who they are. So, at this point, if you have those questions, if you filled out those cards, I think law enforcement can, what's that?
I think you just have them hold it up if they have a card.
Yeah, if you have a card, hold it up and they can be collected. And again, afterwards, if you have additional questions that you don't want sort of read out loud here, come on down here and talk to any of us here. That means to law enforcement, to the agents, to me, to victim services. Stay around for that. Okay, so how do you want to? Sure.
Not a very inquisitive group, apparently, only 3 questions. First question was, what sort of access would or could he have to places of worship?
Yeah.
Yep.
So in regards to that question, initially, Mr. Gallagher and all the people that we supervise are on a very rigid schedule. We don't try to disable or not allow them to have religious ceremonies. So typically what we do is sit down with the minister, the priest, or the leader of that facility or that church, and do have an expectation, a very a general conversation regarding expectations, and then we formulate a plan with that church, with Mr. Gallagher and our team to allow or disallow that to happen.
If anybody has any follow-up questions to the question that was answered, please feel free just to kind of raise your hand and try to elaborate a little more if necessary. Next question. How do you choose the community in which an offender will live in or be released to?
Part of the process that when we're working with the people that are in prison is we look at where they have historic ties, where they have support in place, resources available, and then we try to formulate a plan that best fits those transitioning back into the community. As Mark mentioned, our number one priority is public safety, but secondly, we want to bring this person to a community where they're going to be successful, they're going to have resources, and where they have some history of or foundation where they've been at before.
Yeah, and an important part of that is that we don't make a prior determination of where that best place for them. If they have the support and the ability primarily to have a place to live, opportunity for employment, they've got family support, things like that, whatever is going to work in a public safety basis, they get to choose that place. So it's not entirely correct that that idea of we place. We don't really do that. What we do is we may be doing some assistance, some transition assistance, but primarily it's the person has to come up with a release plan of their own, and then it's reviewed and gone through with the agents. Now, many of those getting out of prison don't necessarily have a lot of resources, so they end up getting a little bit more assistance than others.
Is there family in the community?
In this particular situation, there's no direct family. He does have family in the area and support systems in the area as well, but no immediate family.
As a 13-year-old, he manipulated, meaning that he talked to the 3-year-old and those who may have been caring for her into trusting him, which is a fairly normal way that most offend against, even those they know, is that manipulation. He did not snatch her and pull her off.
What age are offenders usually?
What age are offenders? Offenders can really be any age, but when we look at the risk factors associated with them, one of the things that is very clear and has been demonstrated when we look at all offenders is that at the younger ages and that they're more at risk, and as they get older, their risk goes down. So we are always more concerned. It's easier for a 24-year-old to be designated as a level 3 than it is for a 50-year-old. because what we've seen historically is that sex offenders age out of their crimes, just like almost all crimes. Yes, we still have people who are 50, 60, 70 who commit sex offenses, but they're less likely than somebody who's younger. And we do have offenders, and you have the example tonight. He was 13 as a juvenile. You don't hear about most of those, and most who offend as juveniles don't go on to offend as adults. But again, a unique part of this is when somebody's 18 or 19, there isn't an automatic, they went from being a juvenile to being an adult. If they were troubled at 13, especially with males, we see that a lot of them don't age out of their criminal type behavior until they turn 30. It's age 18 to 21 is a real tough time for some of these criminal behaviors.
Where is he employed?
Right now, Mr. Dolliger does not have a job. Part of the team's responsibility is to assist him and point him in that direction. It is a requirement of being on ISR supervision to maintain 40 hours of constructive activity. And we typically see that in a job or some sort of school setting. But as of today, Mr. Dolliger does not have a job, and that'll be a priority for him and for our team once he gets out.
And the last question might be a little off topic, but how do you become an ISR agent?
We can talk about that afterwards, then we can give you good advice, but essentially you go to school for 4 years and do an internship with the DOC. So if anybody'd like to do that, see Brent or myself or Morgan McKay afterwards.
Are there any other questions anyone would have? For any other group, for questions for law enforcement or prosecution or advocacy? We've got the microphones, you can come on down, or if you'd rather talk private afterward and down front after the presentation's over, you're welcome to do that as well.
Maybe mention that this is going to be recorded.
Yes, I did mention that earlier. This entire presentation is being videotaped, so it will be on cable access at some point in the future and also streamed on YouTube. So if you have friends or family that weren't able to attend tonight and are interested in the presentation, they'll be able to view it at some point in the future. Do you have any closing remarks, Mark? Or?
Nope, that should
Anybody
do
else?
it. But again, contact us if you have questions. You can do it in the future, tonight, whenever.
Well, thank you for coming. I know it was kind of during the dinner hour and stuff, but we'll be down here, and there'll be some folks in the back too, and law enforcement and prosecution. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to stop and talk to one of us. Thank you.